Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Royal Court Sacrifice of Ur. The year is 1922. You're Leonard Woolley, standing in a shaft grave at Ur in southern Iraq, looking down at 74 bodies arranged in neat rows, dressed in their finest clothes, surrounded by lyres and chariots and jewelry. Nothing about the scene looks like violence. They're lying down, calm, like they chose this. You write in your notes that they drank poison and died peacefully, a court following their queen into the next life by choice. For almost 90 years, that's the story every textbook repeats. But nobody had actually looked inside their skulls. Ur was one of the great cities of Sumer, and its royal cemetery, excavated by Woolley between 1922 and 1934, produced tombs unlike anything found before in Mesopotamia. The dates put these burials in the early dynastic period, somewhere around 2600 to 2450 BC. Queen Pwabi's tomb alone held 52 attendants buried with her. Guards at the entrance, musicians with their instruments still in their hands, servants, even the animals that pulled the funeral sledge. But the tomb that made Woolley's career, and the one that hides the real story, is the one archaeologists now call the Great Death Pit. 74 people, laid out in rows so orderly that Woolley assumed it had to be voluntary. Who lies down calmly to die unless they chose it? Every object in that pit was arranged with intention. The lyres weren't tossed in as an afterthought. They were placed near the musicians who had played them in life, strings still resting under fingers that would never move again. The chariot and its sledge animals sat near the drivers who had steered them. Whoever staged this scene was building a household, not hiding evidence, frozen in place, ready to keep functioning the moment the queen needed it in whatever came next. That's what made the peaceful reading so easy to believe for so long. This looked organized rather than chaotic, and organization reads as consent to anyone who isn't looking closely enough. Here's where it gets strange. In 2009, a team led by Janet Mong and Aubrey Bodsgard finally did what nobody in Woolley's era had the equipment to do. They ran CT scans on the skulls from the death pit. Poison doesn't leave a mark on bone. Blunt force does. What the scans found was a pattern of fractures at the back of the skull, the exact kind of injury you'd get from a sharp weapon, driven in hard, from behind, while you were still standing. Not everyone in that pit walked in and lay down to die peacefully. Someone killed them first and arranged the bodies afterward to look calm. The neat rows were the cleanup. And somehow, it gets worse. This wasn't a punishment. Nobody in that pit had done anything wrong. Pwabi's guards, her musicians, her serving staff, they were killed specifically so they could keep serving her after she was dead. Their entire purpose, the reason a weapon was brought down on the backs of their skulls, was so a queen wouldn't have to go into eternity without her household staff. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did, because in early dynastic Ur, this was a demonstration, not a scandal. A new ruler didn't just inherit a throne. They inherited the power to end 74 lives in an afternoon and have it recorded as an honor. Scholars who study the cemetery read the scale of it as a message aimed squarely at every noble household in the city watching. This is what a new sovereign can do to yours, and nobody will ever be required to explain the reason. Woolley himself never doubted the peaceful version. He built his entire account of Sumerian religious devotion around the idea that these people chose this, that loyalty to a queen extended past death by their own free will. That reading survived in museum placards and textbooks for the better part of a century, because nobody thought to x-ray a corpse for a story that already sounded finished. The people running the CT scanner in 2009 weren't looking for anything sinister. They were doing routine forensic verification on bones that had been sitting in storage for 80 years. What they found rewrote the whole ritual. Mass execution, staged afterward to look like a court walking calmly into the afterlife together, and the staging worked on every historian who studied it for 8 decades. There's a reason this story is still talked about in Mesopotamian archaeology today, and it has less to do with the gold, though Ur's royal cemetery has plenty of that, than with the fact that the entire discipline got the manner of death wrong for almost a century, because the ritual was designed to be misread. The bodies had been carefully arranged, dressed, and positioned so that anyone who found them later, whether that was another priest a generation on or an archaeologist 5,000 years later, would read the scene as peaceful. That was staging, built by people who understood exactly how it would look to whoever found it next, and built to lie. What Ur proves is that being killed wasn't even the cruelest part. Poabi's entire staff didn't get a death of their own. They got drafted into hers, then dressed up afterwards so history would remember it as their choice. But at least Ur waited until someone in that court had died before anyone else joined them. The next ritual on this list didn't wait for a death at all. It didn't need one. It just needed a crime small enough that nobody would think to call it murder, and a curse specific enough to make sure the punishment never actually killed you. Number 2. The Bath Curse Tablets. The year is 1979. You're an archaeologist working the drain of the sacred spring at Aquae Sulis, the Roman baths at Bath in England, and the mud keeps giving up small folded sheets of lead and pewter. You unroll one under a lamp. It's a curse, written in ordinary British Latin by someone who was clearly not a priest and clearly furious about something small. A stolen cloak. A missing pair of gloves. You expect a death curse. That's what curses are supposed to do. But this one doesn't ask the goddess to kill anyone. It asks her to make the thief sick, and to keep them sick, until they walk back to this exact spring and confess. Between 1979 and 1980, 130 of these tablets came out of that drain, dating from roughly the 2nd through the 4th century AD. What's strange is how narrow the subject matter is. Curse tablets from elsewhere in the Roman world cover everything. Rivals in love, opponents in the arena, enemies in court. Almost every single tablet at Bath is about theft. Someone's tunic, someone's coin purse, someone's bathing towel, taken right out from under them while they soaked in the spring. And the formula repeats itself tablet after tablet with the precision of a legal document. Let the goddess Sulis Minerva make this person sick until they return what they took. Here's where it gets strange. A death curse ends the problem and ends the thief. This curse did the opposite. It was engineered to keep the thief alive and suffering for as long as it took them to crack. No timeline. No expiration. Just an open wound written into a piece of lead and dropped into sacred water, designed to run for however many months or years it took a guilty conscience or a wasting illness to walk that person back to the spring. The goddess being petitioned, Sulis Minerva, was also the goddess of healing at that exact site. People traveled to her waters to be cured. The same water, the same goddess, was asked in the same breath to withhold the cure from one specific person until they broke. That actually requires believing something specific. You have to believe the goddess is watching closely enough to know who stole your cloak. You have to believe she can reach into that person's body and make them sick without touching anyone else. And you have to believe she'll hold that sickness in place, indefinitely, as a kind of standing account that only clears when the thief personally shows up and admits it. This is a curse asking for a confession, not revenge, with the person's own body as collateral until they pay it. And this is where it gets worse. Sulis Minerva wasn't some obscure local spirit invented for petty grudges. She was the reason Bath existed as a destination at all, a fusion of the Celtic goddess Sulis and the Roman goddess Minerva, presiding over hot springs that people traveled from across the province specifically to be healed by. Every sick person who ever stepped into that water was putting their faith in the exact same goddess being asked, on a different tablet, to make someone else sick and keep them that way. The healing and the punishment came out of the same spring, administered by the same hands, which means nobody bathing at Aquae Sulis on any given day could be entirely sure whether the water in front of them was working for them or against somebody they'd never met. What makes these tablets different from almost every other magical text that survives from the ancient world is who wrote them. These weren't commissioned from professional priests using formal ritual Latin. The grammar is rough. The spelling drifts. Regular Romano-British residents, the kind of people who bathed at that spring on an ordinary afternoon, sat down and wrote their own curses in their own words. This was folk practice, not temple liturgy. Anyone who'd had something stolen could fold a sheet of lead, write out the demand themselves, and drop it into the water believing it would work exactly as written. That accessibility is part of what makes the whole practice so unsettling. This was a tool anyone with a grievance and a scrap of lead could use on their own, without a trial, without the accused ever knowing a curse had been filed against them at all, no priestly authority or magistrate required. Somewhere in the crowd at those baths, on an ordinary day, there could have been a person already sick, or about to get sick, carrying a debt they didn't know existed and would never get the chance to pay off, because they never even learned the charge had been made. And that's the detail that makes this worse than any death curse could have been. A death curse is finished the moment it lands. This one was built to never finish. Somewhere in Roman Britain, They were people who spent years of their life sick, in the way this specific curse describes, without ever knowing whether their symptoms were an illness or a debt somebody else had written down in lead and thrown into a spring. There's no evidence any thief ever confessed. There's no evidence the illness ever lifted. The tablets just describe the mechanism and stop. Whatever happened to the people they were aimed at happened somewhere outside the written record, alone, without the one piece of information that could have ended it, knowing exactly what they'd been cursed with, or why. A stolen towel got you an illness with no cure clause. But Rome had a version of this same instinct that operated on a much bigger scale, reserved for emperors and for anyone powerful enough to be worth erasing completely. Number 3. Damnatio Memoriae. The year is 211 a day. You're standing under the arch of the Argentarii in Rome, looking up at a carved family scene that used to show the Emperor Septimius Severus, his wife, and their 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. Except now, there's a blank space where Geta's face used to be, not weathered away. Chiseled out, deliberately, with tool marks you can still run your fingers over today. Caracalla murdered his own brother that year, and the first thing Rome did afterward wasn't hold a funeral. It was sent masons out to every monument in the city with instructions to cut Geta out of existence. This punishment had a name. Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. And it wasn't reserved for Geta. When the Emperor Domitian was assassinated on September 18, 96 AD, the Senate voted the same sentence on him within hours. Pliny the Younger, writing not long after, describes the public joy at watching those statues come down. Crowds attacking them in the street, the same way they would have attacked the man himself if he were still alive to reach. His coins were pulled and recast. His arches were torn out of the ground. Officially, it was as if Domitian had never existed at all. In Egypt more than 1,000 years earlier, the pharaoh Hatshepsut got the same treatment after her death, around 1458 BC. Her successor, Thutmose III, ordered her name chiseled off every obelisk and temple wall she'd built, her face hacked out of the reliefs at Deir el-Bahri, her achievements quietly reassigned to male rulers who never earned them. Here's where it gets strange. To the people carrying out these erasures, this wasn't symbolic. In the ancient world, especially in Egypt, your name and your image weren't just a record of you. They were believed to be load-bearing for your existence in the next life. Cut the name, cut the face, and you weren't just being punished on earth. You were being unmade in a way that a normal execution never touched. A death sentence takes your life. Damnatio Memoriae was designed to take the part of you that was supposed to survive it. Look at what that meant specifically for Hatshepsut. She wasn't a minor ruler whose reign slipped quietly out of memory. She was one of the most successful pharaohs Egypt ever produced, responsible for major building projects and a long, stable period of prosperity. Thutmose III didn't just neglect her legacy after taking the throne. He spent resources actively dismantling it, sending workers to chisel her name and image out of structures she had personally commissioned, then reassigning credit for her accomplishments to male predecessors as if she had simply never held power at all. The effort required to erase a builder that's successful tells you how seriously Egypt took the belief that a name left standing was a name still, in some sense, alive. If this is the kind of history that gets under your skin, you're exactly who this channel is for, so go ahead and hit subscribe, because there are 7 more of these still to get through, and the middle of this list is where it actually gets worse than anything you've heard so far. Here's the detail that makes this trap even stranger than it looks. It didn't actually work. Modern epigraphers going back through the surviving inscriptions of the Roman Empire have counted somewhere between 385 and 467 mentions of Domitian that survived the supposed erasure, scattered across records the Senate never managed to reach. The Masons couldn't get to every province, every private dedication, every tax record with his name on it. Damnatio Memoriae was less a total historical wipe than a public ritual, performed loudly enough for the living to see it happen, whether or not it actually succeeded at the thing it claimed to be doing. Rome needed you to watch a man get erased, not for the erasure itself to be complete. That gap between the performance and the reality is what makes this punishment so unsettling. The people ordering it knew, on some level, that total erasure was impossible. Coins get buried. Inscriptions get carved in places nobody remembers to check. What they actually wanted was the public spectacle of watching a person's name get physically cut out of stone, in front of witnesses, as proof that the state could reach even into your legacy and take it apart piece by piece, built entirely around the idea that being forgotten is worse than being killed, staged as theater specifically, so the people watching would believe it. And it still leaves a mark. Stand under that arch today and the blank space where Getta's face used to be is more visible than if the carving had just weathered away naturally. The absence draws your eye exactly where his portrait should be. 2,000 years later, the erasure is still the most noticeable thing on the entire monument, a permanent, unmistakable reminder that someone used to be there, and someone with enough power hated him enough to cut him out by hand. The same pattern shows up on the Severin Tondo, a painted wooden portrait of the whole imperial family that somehow survived from this period, one of the only surfaces from this era where you can still see faces in color instead of carved stone. Getta's face on that panel has been scraped away too, the paint physically removed down to the wood underneath, while his father, mother, and brother remain fully intact around the hole where he used to be. A family portrait with one face missing is a strange thing to preserve at all, and yet Rome kept it exactly like that. Rome could erase your name from a monument, but at least the erasure only reached your legacy. The next ritual on this list didn't touch a monument at all. It reached directly into what was left of your body, and turned your own skull into something someone else would use for the rest of their life. Number 4. The Scythian Skull Cups. The year is 450 BC. You're the Greek historian Herodotus, sitting with a Scythian informant somewhere on the edge of the Black Sea steppe, taking notes on a custom you're fairly sure your Greek readers won't believe. He tells you exactly how it's done. You saw the skull below the eyebrows, so the whole upper dome comes away clean. You clean out what's left inside. You stretch raw leather over the outside, tight, so it holds its shape and hardens as it dries. And if the man whose skull this used to be was somebody rich or notable, you don't stop there. You line the inside with gold. Then you drink from it at feasts in front of other people for years. You write it down almost matter-of-factly, because to the Scythians this was a trophy custom, not an atrocity, openly practiced, openly discussed. Herodotus records the practice in Book 4 of his histories, and for centuries afterward, that was the only evidence anyone had that it was real. One Greek writer's account of a steppe culture he only knew secondhand. Skeptics assumed it was exaggeration, the kind of shocking detail a historian includes to make foreign people sound suitably barbaric to a home audience. The skull cup wasn't even the only trophy Herodotus describes in that same passage. A few lines earlier in the same account, he records that Scythian warriors scalped their enemies too, cutting the skin from the skull, cleaning it, and wearing the finished scalps hung from their bridles like decoration. The more scalps hanging there, the more respected the rider. A warrior's own horse became a kind of walking tally of exactly how many men he'd killed, worn openly, in public, every time he rode into camp. Here's where it gets strange. The archaeology caught up. Excavations at a Scythian hill fort called Belske, on a tributary of the Dnieper River in what's now Ukraine, dated to roughly 700 to 300 BC, turned up actual worked skull fragments, cut and shaped exactly the way Herodotus described. Not myth. Not exaggeration for a Greek audience. A real physically confirmed practice, done with enough consistency that archaeologists could recognize the cut marks on site, more than 2,000 years after the fact. The Roman-era geographer Strabo independently backs up the same account, describing Scythians scalping and beheading enemies specifically to make drinking vessels, writing from a completely different source tradition than Herodotus had access to. Here's what that actually meant for the man on the losing end. Losing a battle against the Scythians didn't just mean dying. It meant becoming furniture. Your skull didn't get buried, didn't get returned to your family, didn't get any of the rituals your own culture would have used to send you into whatever came next. It became a cup, sitting on a table, refilled and passed around at every feast your killer hosted for the rest of his life. Every time he drank from it in front of guests, he was showing off exactly whose head this used to belong to. Your usefulness to the person who killed you was only just beginning. And this wasn't a private trophy, kept quietly in a tent somewhere out of sight. Herodotus is specific that Scythians used these cups when important visitors came to the house, meaning the object was designed for display, brought out specifically at the moments when a warrior most wanted to impress somebody. Every guest who ever drank from it, whether or not they knew what it was, became part of the performance. The dead man's skull was put to work, night after night, not just kept, as a conversation piece at somebody else's dinner table, doing exactly the job his killer wanted it to do for as long as the leather held together. And the detail that makes this worse than almost anything else on this list is the status marker built into it. The poorer version of this practice, plain leather, no gold, was still humiliating enough on its own. But the wealthy version, the gold lining Herodotus specifically describes, meant that the more important you were in life, the more elaborate your own degradation became after death. Being a king or a chieftain only changed the quality of the cup, not whether you became one. Status followed you into the afterlife in exactly the wrong direction. The more valuable your enemies considered you, the more effort they put into making sure your skull looked good on their table. There's no confession clause here, no way to buy your way out of it, no ritual your family could perform to reclaim what was left of you. Once your skull left the battlefield in a Scythian saddlebag, it was gone from any afterlife tradition your own people practiced, unburied and unremembered, useful to somebody else now, permanently. Compare that to almost every other culture on this list, and the skull cup stands out for how little ceremony surrounds it. You staged a household. Rome staged a funeral procession. Even the Nazca, later on this list, treated a severed head as something worth ritually processing with care. The Scythians didn't dress this practice up as religion or ceremony at all. Herodotus records it as plain function, a useful object made from available material, the same way you'd describe tanning a hide or shaping a bowl. That absence of ritual is its own kind of horror. Somewhere on the steppe, your skull was just a useful object, nothing sacred about it. The Scythians turned an enemy's skull into a permanent fixture at their table. But at least a skull cup only needed one act of violence to make. The next culture on this list built an entire ritual around inflicting as many different kinds of violence on the same body as they possibly could, in a single afternoon, and one specific mutilation had nothing to do with killing you at all. Number 5. The Bog Body Overkill Ritual. The year is 1984. You're a worker on a peat-cutting machine in Lindo Moss, Cheshire, in England, and the blade just brought up a human foot. What comes out of the bog over the next few days still has skin on it, still has fingernails, preserved almost 2,000 years by the exact chemistry that makes a bog a terrible place to farm and a perfect place to hide a body. Pathologists examine what's left of him and find something that stops them cold. This man wasn't killed once. He has a heavy blow to the back of the skull. He has a cord twisted so tight around his neck that his neck itself is broken, and his throat is cut. Any one of the three would have killed him on its own. Somebody made sure of all three anyway. Lindo Moss sits in the middle of Cheshire, land the Iron Age communities of the region would have known intimately, not some remote wilderness where a body could vanish by accident. Whoever put him there had easy access to the bog and knew exactly what it would do to a body over time, which rules out a hurried, opportunistic killing. Researchers have a specific term for this: overkill. Not a fight that got out of hand, not a botched execution, a deliberate application of more violence than the death required. And Lindo Man's is one of the clearest examples ever recovered from a European bog. But he's not alone. In County Offaly, Ireland, in 2003, another bog gave up a man now called Old Croghan Man, radiocarbon dated to somewhere between 362 and 175 BC. He'd been restrained with rope pulled through holes cut in his own upper arms. He'd been stabbed. He'd been cut in half at the waist. And before any of that, his nipples had been sliced off. Here's where it gets strange. That one detail, the nipples, doesn't fit the pattern of the rest of the violence. Stabbing kills you. Cutting you in half is overkill on top of an already dead body. But slicing off a man's nipples doesn't do either of those things. Archaeologist Eamon Kelly, working with the National Museum of Ireland, connected it to an old Irish tradition. Sucking a king's nipples was a recorded gesture of submission to his authority. Cut them off, and you haven't just killed a man. You've made it structurally impossible for him to ever have been a legitimate king, or to become one, no matter what his bloodline said. The mutilation wasn't about killing him faster so much as making sure that whatever else happened to him that day, kingship was permanently off the table. Not every bog body fits the overkill pattern exactly. Toland Man, found in Denmark in 1950, was strangled with a leather cord still knotted around his neck when he was pulled from the peat. A death researchers connect to fertility ritual rather than punishment. Even the calm on his face, the same calm that made him one of the most famous archaeological finds in Europe, is part of what makes the Old Croghan and Lindo cases feel so different by comparison. Toland Man looks like someone who was already gone before the cord tightened. Old Krogan Man does not, because everything done to him happened while the injuries could still stack, one on top of the last. What ties these bodies together across different bogs and different centuries is where they were left. Old Krogan Man and several related finds were positioned along what researchers believe were ancient tribal boundary lines, not buried out of sight in consecrated ground, but placed as a landmark somewhere the whole community would eventually pass by. For the people who lived near that boundary afterward, this wasn't a punishment that ended with the sentence being carried out. It was a punishment that kept being carried out every time someone walked past that stretch of bog and remembered exactly why a body had been left there. The mutilation stripped the man of his claim to legitimacy. The location turned his death into a permanent public notice. Two separate punishments, layered onto one body, designed to outlast the funeral by centuries. You'd think somebody eventually forgot why the marker was there. The bog didn't let them. It kept the body intact enough that 2,000 years later, we can still read exactly what was done to him and in what order. That's the pattern across every bog body like this. Violence stacked specifically to close off more than just a life, engineered to strip your legitimacy and then put you on permanent, preserved display at a boundary your whole community would keep crossing. The preservation itself is what makes this trap unlike almost anything else on this list. Most of the punishments here rely on time to erase the evidence, a body decomposing, a monument weathering, a memory fading. The bog worked in exactly the opposite direction. Low oxygen, high acidity, and cold water combined to tan the skin and stop decay almost entirely, which means the boundary marker didn't degrade the way an ordinary grave would have. It stayed legible. It stayed a warning in something close to its original condition, for as long as anyone kept walking that stretch of ground. But nothing about these mutilations required planning further ahead than the day of the killing itself. The next ritual on this list didn't happen in a single violent afternoon. It was built slowly, over months, against a victim who was never an adult, and never given any warning at all about what the ritual actually required of them. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. The Inca Capacacha. The year is 1995. You're Johann Reinhard, a mountaineering archaeologist, climbing the 20,700-foot summit of Mount Amparo in Peru on September 8th, and near the crater's edge, you find a bundle that shouldn't exist this intact after 5 centuries. Inside it is a girl, maybe 12 to 14 years old, frozen so completely that her internal organs are still there. Her clothing still holds its color. Her face still has an expression on it. The world will come to know her as Juanita, the Ice Maiden. What killed her isn't the freezing, not exactly. A Johns Hopkins CT scan finds a severe blow to the back of her skull. Somebody struck her, up here, at the edge of the sky, and then left her. The ritual that put her there is called Capacacha, and it translates roughly to royal obligation. Children, selected specifically for the purity Inca religion demanded of an offering, were walked from across the empire to Cusco, then out again to the summit of a sacred mountain, sometimes a journey of hundreds of miles on foot. This was planned months, sometimes close to a year in advance, nothing like an execution carried out in a moment of panic or anger. And the ritual's entire design was built around making sure the child didn't fight, didn't run, and didn't fully understand, until it was already too late, exactly what was about to happen to them. That long walk to Cusco was part of the design, not incidental logistics. A child taken from a distant province and marched for weeks through Inca territory. Fed well, dressed in fine woven cloth, treated with a degree of ceremony most people in that empire never received in their entire life, had every reason to believe they were being honored rather than processed. By the time the mountain came into view, the child had spent months being told, in every way the empire knew how, that this was the greatest privilege of their short life. Here's where it gets strange. At the Llullaillaco volcano in Argentina, 3 more Capacacha children were discovered in 1999. And researchers were able to do something with these remains that they couldn't do with most ancient burials. They tested the hair. Hair grows at a fixed, predictable rate, and it holds a chemical record of everything that passed through the body while it was growing. The isotope data from these children's hair shows a clear pattern. Coca leaf consumption and corn beer, called chicha, increase gradually over the final months of their lives, then spike sharply right at the very end. These children weren't sedated once, quickly, before the ritual began. They were dosed with increasing regularity for months, their bodies slowly acclimated to substances that would culminate, on the final night, in enough alcohol to put them past the point of resistance entirely. Alcohol does something specific to the human body in cold conditions. It suppresses the shivering reflex, the automatic response that keeps you fighting to stay warm. Researchers studying the Lulialaco children believe this was the mechanism, not an incidental side effect. Get a child drunk enough, high enough on coca, and their body stops trying to save itself. They stop shivering. They stop feeling the cold as an emergency. And then you place them, still breathing, in a small stone niche cut into the mountainside, arrange them in a seated position with offerings around them, and seal the entrance. Hypothermia does the rest, slowly, without the child's body fighting back against it, because the fighting reflex had already been chemically switched off. Think about what that actually is. A sacrifice engineered specifically to look gentle on the surface while staying merciless underneath it, nothing like a knife and a single moment. The Inca weren't trying to kill these children quickly. If speed had been the goal, there were faster ways available to them, and other cultures on this list used them. The Capacache ritual was built, deliberately, layer by layer, over months of preparation, to produce a death that looked peaceful from the outside. A sleeping child, curled in a stone niche, surrounded by beautiful offerings, no violence visible anywhere. But peaceful and painless are not the same thing, and a child left conscious enough to register the cold, however dulled, before the alcohol and the altitude finally took them under, experienced something that no textbook description of a quick ritual death comes close to capturing. And somehow, it gets worse. Being selected was, within Inca religious logic, an honor tied directly to imperial politics, not something reserved for accidents of birth or bad luck. As the empire expanded, Capacacha sacrifices were used to formally mark new territory as belonging to the Inca state, the child's death functioning as a kind of living deed planted on a mountaintop the empire wanted to claim. Some children weren't randomly chosen. They were the sons and daughters of local nobility in newly conquered regions, offered specifically because their deaths bound that territory, and that family, to Cusco, in a way no treaty could. You'd think somebody eventually said, no. The historical record doesn't show it. What it shows instead is a ritual so carefully engineered, chemically and psychologically, that resistance was designed out of the process almost entirely before the child ever reached the summit. That's the part that separates Capacacha from almost everything else on this list. It's not the altitude. It's not even the cold. It's that every step, the months of coca, the escalating chicha, the final cup that put a child past the point of feeling what came next, was built specifically to remove the one thing that makes any other death recognizable as violence. A person fighting to stay alive. The mountain took children slowly enough that they never fully understood what was happening to them. But the next ritual on this list didn't need a mountain at all. It built its cruelty directly into a public arena, in front of a crowd, and it did something almost nobody expects. It offered its victim a real chance to survive, and then made sure that chance was never quite real. Number 7. The Aztec Gladiator Sacrifice. The year is 2017. You're part of INAH's Urban Archaeology program, working beneath a colonial-era building just west of the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, and you've just uncovered a circular structure roughly 16 to 20 feet across, built entirely out of human skulls mortared, together with lime, sand, and volcanic gravel, every face turned inward toward the center. This is the Huit Sampantli, and by the time the count is finished, your team has recorded 650 skulls in this tower alone. A follow-up excavation in 2020 adds 119 more. And this is where the assumption that made sense on paper stops holding up. Among the newer skulls are women and children, people who had no business being counted among captured enemy warriors, which is what a trophy skull tower like this was supposed to represent. Some sacrificial victims at Templo Mayor were selected specifically to impersonate the god Zyptotic during the festival of Tlacaxipowalistli, the feast of the flaying of men, and that ritual is where a captive's skull began its journey to a tower like this one. After the sacrifice, priests flayed the body and wore the skin themselves, for roughly 20 days, a symbol of renewal, the way a seed sheds its dried husk before something new grows underneath. But the version of this ritual that should genuinely unsettle you was reserved for the ones who were given a chance, not the ones who never had one. In the Tamalacatl ritual, a captive was tethered by the ankle to a large circular stone in front of a crowd. He was handed a weapon, but not a real one. A club edged with feathers instead of obsidian blades, useless against anything but appearance. Then, one at a time, fully armed eagle and jaguar warriors, carrying real Makuahidal swords lined with actual obsidian, were sent at him. Up to 4, sometimes 7 of them, across the fight. If, somehow, against every odd the ritual was designed to prevent, he beat them all, he was granted his freedom. If he lost, and the odds guaranteed almost everyone lost, a priest was already positioned to open him up immediately, on the stone, in front of the same crowd that had just watched him fight for a chance that was never really there. We're 7 items into this list now, and if this pattern has been getting under your skin the way it's supposed to, that's exactly what the subscribe button is for. One tap, and the next one's already waiting in your feed instead of something you have to go looking for. Here's where it gets strange, and it doesn't have anything to do with the fighting itself. Public executions by combat existed in plenty of ancient cultures, so the combat itself isn't what makes the Tamalacatl worse than a straightforward execution. What makes this one different is the specific, deliberate gap between what the captive was told and what the ritual actually allowed. He wasn't lied to about the danger. He could see the warriors, see the real blades, understand exactly what he was facing. What he wasn't told, or wasn't allowed to fully believe, was how narrow the margin for survival actually was, tethered in place, armed with a weapon incapable of doing real damage, against professional soldiers who trained for exactly this. The hope was mathematically almost impossible, while still being technically, on paper, real, and that's a crueler design than no hope at all, because a sliver of real hope means you fight anyway, all the way to the end, believing until the very last moment that this might be the version of the story where you walk away. And then, whether he'd fought well or badly, whether the crowd had cheered for him or against him, the outcome for almost every one of these captives was the same. Disembowelment on the stone, the body afterward processed the same way as every other sacrifice at the Templo Mayor, some of them eventually contributing to towers exactly like the one excavated in 2017 and 2020. The skull didn't know or care how bravely its owner had fought. It went into the wall face first with all the others. That's what makes the discovery of women's and children's skulls in the 2020 excavation land so differently once you understand the Tamalacatl. A skull tower built purely from defeated warriors at least tells a story about combat, however brutal. A tower that also contains people who never stood a chance at the stone, who were never handed a feathered club or a crowd to fight in front of, suggests the ritual machinery around Templo Mayor was pulling in far more of the population than the gladiatorial spectacle alone could explain, and that the tower itself was never really about honoring anyone's fight at all. Psychologically, the Tamalacatl manufactures something specific in the moments before the fight begins, something closer to false agency than despair. The belief that your own skill, your own fight, your own choices in that arena might actually matter when the ritual's entire structure was built to make sure they almost never could. You were made to participate in your own death, fighting for a freedom the system was never seriously offering, and giving everything you had left toward an outcome that had already been decided the moment they tethered you to that stone. The Aztecs at least let their captives see the blades coming. The next ritual on this list didn't need combat, didn't need a crowd, and didn't need the victim conscious for most of what happened. It needed a knife, a skull, and a very specific reason not to bury the body when it was done. Number 8. The Nazca Trophy Heads. The year is roughly 400 BC, somewhere on the southern coast of Peru, and you're watching a Nazca ritual specialist finish a process that has nothing to do with a battlefield. An obsidian knife severs the head at the neck. The base of the skull is broken away. The soft tissue inside, the tongue, the throat muscle, everything that would rot and smell, gets discarded. The brain comes out next. What's left is an empty shell, which gets packed with cloth to hold its shape, and then a hole is drilled straight through the forehead. A cord threads through that hole. The head is no longer a head. It's an object now, built specifically to be carried, and some of these still have their original hair and their original carrying cord attached when archaeologists find them more than 2,000 years later. This isn't a rare or isolated find. More than 100 Nazca trophy heads, dating from around 400 BC to 600 AD, have been recovered along Peru's southern coast, an unusually large collection compared to how rarely most ancient cultures preserved trophy-taking in a form archaeologists can actually study. The obvious assumption, the one that made intuitive sense for decades, was that these were war trophies, heads taken from defeated enemies in raids between rival groups. That assumption held until somebody actually tested the bones. Here's where it gets strange. In 2009, researchers ran a strontium and oxygen isotope study on a set of these trophy heads, the kind of analysis that can trace where a person spent their childhood based on the chemical signature locked into their teeth and bone. The results pointed inward, not outward toward some rival territory. Many of the victims came from the same region, the same culture, as the people who had turned their heads into carrying objects. This was, in large part, an internal practice. The Nazca were doing this to their own people. At Cahuachi, the Nazca's main ceremonial center, archaeologist Giuseppe Orfecci spent 26 years excavating the site, and his conclusion reframes the entire practice. The heads recovered there functioned as what he calls offering heads, not battlefield trophies displayed to intimidate enemies, but ritual objects tied to religious ceremony, likely connected to agricultural fertility and the region's precarious relationship with water in one of the driest environments on Earth. At Cerro Carapo, a separate cache of 48 trophy heads gives researchers the largest single documented collection of this material ever found in one place. Further evidence that this was a sustained, organized practice, carried out again and again over centuries, not scattered, incidental violence. 26 years is worth sitting with for a second. That's how long it took one archaeologist working one site to build enough evidence to overturn the trophy of war theory because the practice wasn't confined to a single dramatic discovery. It was woven so thoroughly into the ceremonial life of Cahuachi, recurring generation after generation, that understanding it properly meant excavating a career's worth of material rather than a single dig season. A tradition that consistent running that long is the record of an institution, not occasional wartime brutality. That actually reframes something. This wasn't punishment for a crime, and it wasn't purely the aftermath of conflict with an outside enemy. Somewhere in Nazca society, there was a structure that selected people from within the community itself to become ritual objects, their heads surgically emptied and repurposed, likely as part of ceremonies meant to secure rain or good harvest for everyone else. The point of the ritual was the head's continued existence as a physical object, carried, displayed, kept as part of ongoing ceremony, long after the person's death. Being killed would have been the easy version of what happened to them. What actually happened is that their body was denied burial entirely, their brain removed, their skull hollowed and repurposed into something the community would keep using, indefinitely, long after anyone remembered whose face used to be attached to it. There's no equivalent, in Nazca religious practice, to a funeral for these victims. No grave goods, no burial ground, no ritual send-off into whatever the Nazca believed came after death. Their head became infrastructure instead, a working part of somebody else's ongoing relationship with their gods. The care and the processing is what makes this hardest to look away from. This wasn't rushed battlefield mutilation, hacked apart in the chaos of a raid. Removing the brain, packing the cavity with cloth to preserve the head's shape, drilling a precise hole through the forehead, rather than shattering the bone. All of that takes time, skill, and a steady hand working on a body that had very recently been a person. Someone in Nazca society was good at this specific task, practiced enough to do it the same careful, way more than 100 times across 2 centuries of recovered evidence. And unlike almost every other item on this list, where the cruelty ends once the body is disposed of, a trophy head gets kept, maintained, carried at ceremonies for years, decades, as long as the cord holding it together survives, the victim still being used long after everyone who remembered their face is gone too. Nazca ritual took your head and turned it into something the living kept carrying for years. But the next site on this list didn't need a living person to do the carrying at all. It found a body, left it exactly where it fell, and let the cave itself take over the job of keeping that body forever. Number 9. The Crystal Maiden of the Cave of the Crystal Sepulchre. The year is whenever you decide to actually make the trip, because this is one of the only entries on this list you can still walk up to in person. Deep inside Actun Tunashil Muknal, the Cave of the Crystal Sepulchre, in Belize, after wading through cold water and squeezing through passages that force you to turn your headlamp sideways, you reach a chamber where a skeleton lies exactly where it fell, sometime around 700 to 900 AD. Except, It doesn't look like bone anymore. Over more than 1,000 years, mineral-rich water dripping through the limestone above has coated the skeleton in a slow, continuous layer of calcite, and now the bones catch your headlamp and throw it back in 100 small points of light, like the body has been very gradually turning to crystal from the outside in. Researchers have recovered at least 14 sets of human remains from this cave, alongside ceramics and stoneware left as offerings, most of it dated to the late classic Maya period, right around the time drought pressure was beginning to strain Maya civilization across the region. Caves like this one held a specific religious weight for the Maya. They were understood as entrances to the underworld, and offerings made inside them, including human sacrifice, were tied to appeals to Chak, the rain god, at exactly the moments when rain had stopped falling where it was needed, made in the one place the Maya believed the god responsible for rain could actually hear it. 14 sets of remains in one cave means this was a location the Maya kept returning to. Generation after generation, whenever the rain stopped falling long enough to threaten the harvest. Not a single desperate act during one especially bad drought year. Each new offering was carried down through the same cold water, the same narrow passages, past the bodies of everyone who had already been given to Chak before them. Which means every new victim walked in, already able to see exactly what waiting inside the underworld's doorway looked like. Here's where it gets strange, and it's the kind of detail that should make you rethink everything you assumed walking in. The skeleton has been known publicly for years as the Crystal Maiden, a name that implies exactly what it sounds like, a young woman, sacrificed, now calcified into the cave floor. Later skeletal analysis complicated that story. The bone structure is more consistent with a male individual, likely a teenager, around 17 years old at the time of death. The name stuck anyway, repeated in guidebooks and documentaries long after the science underneath it had shifted, which means most people who have ever heard of this site have been picturing the wrong person for years, layered right on top of a body that was never buried in the first place. Reaching this chamber at all takes effort most visitors to an ancient site never have to make. There's no paved path, no staircase, no gift shop at the entrance. You wade through a jungle river to reach the mouth of the cave, then keep wading, sometimes chest deep, through total darkness broken only by your own light, climbing over boulders and squeezing through gaps barely wider than your shoulders, for the better part of an hour before the chamber even comes into view. The Maya who carried a living offering down this same route weren't taking a shortcut either. Every step of that approach was already part of the ritual, a passage getting harder and darker the closer you came to the god waiting at the end of it. Here's what makes this different from every other item on this list. Almost everything else here happened once, a specific act of violence carried out on a specific day, its aftermath frozen at the moment it was discovered. This one didn't stop. The moment this teenager's body hit the cave floor, the process that would eventually calcify it into the bedrock had already started, and it has not stopped since. It's still happening right now, while you watch this. The water is still dripping. The mineral layer is still building, fraction by fraction, exactly as it has for over 1,000 years. This is a body actively being consumed by the cave, slowly, permanently, in real time, not one that was preserved once and left alone, with no scheduled point where that process stops. And there's no burial to interrupt it. No family collected these remains. No ritual moved the body somewhere else once the sacrifice was complete. Unlike a body sealed in a tomb, deliberately hidden from every future eye, this one was left in a chamber the Maya themselves kept walking back through for other offerings, and centuries later, kept open again for anyone willing to wade in with a headlamp. The cave became the grave, the crypt, and the ongoing physical process all at once, and it's still open. Tourists walk through this exact chamber today, headlamps up, looking directly at a body that has never once, in over 1,000 years, been given the thing every other culture on this list at least eventually granted its dead. An ending. A point where the process of what happens to a body after death is considered complete. This one is still in progress. It has been in progress the entire time you've been watching this video. The cave never let this body go. It's still working on it, mineral drop by mineral drop, more than 1,000 years after the sacrifice that put it there. But the final ritual on this list didn't need a cave, didn't need centuries, and didn't even need its victim to actually be dead yet, before the ceremony that ended her life had already begun. Number 10. The Vestal Virgins, buried alive at their own funeral. The year is 91 AD. You're standing in the Roman Forum watching something that looks, at first glance, like an ordinary funeral procession. A closed litter moves slowly through the crowd, mourners walking alongside it in silence, headed toward the Colline Gate. Except the woman inside that litter isn't dead. Her name is Cornelia, she's a Vestal, and the Emperor Domitian has just condemned her for breaking her vow of chastity. Rome has a rule that goes back centuries. A Vestal's blood is sacred, and spilling it is considered a crime against the gods themselves, no matter what she's done. So instead of an execution, Rome builds her a funeral while she's still breathing, and marches her through the city as the corpse in her own procession. Becoming a Vestal was one of the most honored roles a Roman woman could hold, not a punishment or a demotion, according to the order's rules as recorded by Plutarch in his Life of Numa. Girls were chosen between roughly 6 and 10 years old and bound to a 30-year vow. 10 years learning the role, 10 years performing it, 10 years training the next generation. Their central duty was tending the sacred fire of Vesta, a flame that was never allowed to go out, because Rome believed the city's own survival was tied to it. Letting the fire die was itself a punishable offense. Breaking the vow of chastity that came with the role was the only offense serious enough to end in this. Before the procession even started, they'd already stripped her of her vitae, the sacred woolen fillets that had marked her as a Vestal in the first place, and scourged her, so that by the time the litter began moving through the forum, part of the punishment had already happened in private, out of public view, before the public part of it had even begun. At the Campus Celeratus, the evil field, near the Colline Gate, they lower her into an underground chamber. Inside is a lamp, some bread, a little water, milk, and oil, enough supplies to survive a few days if she rationed carefully, which was never really the point. The lamp would only burn for so long before the oil ran out, and once it did, whatever happened to her after that happened in absolute dark, underground, with no way to measure how much of the bread and water was left, or how many hours were actually passing above her. The mourners who walked beside the litter the whole way they were performing real grief, not theater. To them, the moment the earth closed over that chamber was, functionally, her funeral, complete and final, even though the woman it was honoring was still alive to hear the dirt hit the ground above her. Once she's inside, the chamber is sealed and covered over with earth until no trace of it remains, no marker, nothing to show a person is buried alive directly beneath your feet. Rome's own writer Pliny the Younger recorded Cornelia's case directly, describing her final words invoking the goddess Vesta, and describing how she refused to take the executioner's hand as they lowered her down, going into that chamber on her own, upright, aware of exactly what was happening to her the entire time. Here's where it gets strange, and it's the detail that ties this entire list together. The man who ordered this, Emperor Domitian, the same man from number 3 on this list, was assassinated 5 years later, in 96 AD. And the Roman Senate did to Domitian exactly what he had spent his reign doing to people he considered a threat. They voted damnatio memoriae against him within hours of his death. His statues were melted down. His arches were torn apart. His name was struck from every record the Senate could reach. The emperor who buried a woman alive, specifically so Rome, could pretend it hadn't spilled her blood, was, within 5 years, buried himself, in a sense, by his own government. Erased, chiseled out, denied the one thing every Roman believed mattered more than the moment of death itself, a name that survived it. Think about what Rome actually built here, because it's the same design running underneath every single item on this list. What Rome wanted for Cornelia was slow, not the quick death that's finished the moment it happens. They wanted a woman to walk, consciously, through her own funeral, past mourners who knew exactly what they were watching, down into a sealed room with just enough supplies to make the ending slow instead of immediate. And what the Senate wanted for Domitian afterward wasn't a quick execution either. It never got the chance. But the erasure that followed his death was built on that same logic. Death alone was never considered sufficient punishment, and neither the state condemning Cornelia nor the state that later condemned Domitian believed a single moment of dying could ever be cruelty enough. Cornelia isn't the only Vestal this happened to either. The punishment recurs across Roman history whenever a Vestal was formally condemned, which tells you this was a standing legal procedure, not a one-time cruelty improvised under a particularly harsh emperor with a fixed location, a fixed set of supplies, and a fixed ritual script, ready to be carried out again whenever Rome decided the charge had been proven. A punishment doesn't get that specific, that repeatable, by accident. Somebody sat down, generations before Cornelia was ever born, and worked out exactly how much bread and oil would make a burial chamber cruel enough to satisfy the law without technically spilling a drop of sacred blood. Every single culture on this list had access to a fast, clean death, and every single one of them chose something slower and more deliberate instead. A fast death was always the mercy, and none of them were interested in showing it. Tell me where you're watching this from, drop it in the comments, and if this kind of history is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe for more.